Yevgeny, Yevgeny, wherefore art thou, Yevgeny, 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 Yevgeny.
I am just another soldier boy, just another soldier boy, looking for work,
Yevgeny,
looking for work,
Yevgeny,
looking for war. My rifle is my friend,
Yevgeny,
my rifle is my friend. I clean my rifle every day, that's why my rifle is my friend. Ready for war, ready for war, ready for war, ready for war. Did some work in Zaire, the dirty old Belgian Congo. Went back to Geneva to get paid. Back up in Geneva, that's where the money flows. That's where the money flows. That's where the money grows. They didn't want to pay me. Ha! They didn't want to pay me, but they did. Cause trying to separate me from my money, that's like separating me from my life. Ready for war. Ready for war. Ready for war. Ready for war. Let's go to Moscow. Let's go to Moscow. Let's go, let's go, let's go to Moscow. Find the back door to the Kremlin. Push it down and walk on in. Say, ha-da-da-do-dee-ah-do-dee-ah. Ha-ha-da-da-do-dee-ah. Let's go, must go, must go, must go, must go to Moscow. 3,000 feet and closing. Target visibility 19. 2,000 feet and closing. Target visibility 76. 1,000 feet and closing. Visibility 98. 500 feet and closing. Visibility 0. Ready for war. Ready for war. Ready for war. Ready for war. Are you ready for war? Are you ready for war? You better be ready for war. You better be ready for war. Ready for war. Ready for war.
Reports are that Prigozhin has just signed a deal with Blackwater. breaking news at 11. And welcome to another rendition of Radio Tipping Point. Mike Boyle at the controls, and this will be the first part of a two-part series that is titled Vloges Shtetl. And it was a project that I started last year. The ideas flickering around in my mind. And as it is quite often, you stop back and you revisit something that you were working on, where you had certain thoughts at that time. You had certain intentions. And it was quite interesting to revisit this material because it could never be as it was, and it will never be as it is. That being said, the idea of looking at our current situation, now that we've reached day 500, and all the intrigue that is tied to the events taking place 1,000 kilometers from our east, got me thinking about some oblique parallels that going way back. But before we go down that path, I'd like to read you a short passage from a piece that was published in this week's Economist. Big wars are tragedies for the people and countries that fight them. They also transform how the world prepares for conflict, with momentous consequences for global security. Britain, France, and Germany sent observers to the American Civil War to study battles like Gettysburg. The tank duels of the Yom Kippur War in 1973 accelerated the shift of America's army from the force that lost in Vietnam to the one that thumped Iraq in 1991. That campaign in turn led China's leaders to rebuild the People's Liberation Army into the formidable force it is today. So as we can see from this quote coming from The Economist, all these actions totally negate the effect that it has on human beings. All we really care about is what we can learn on a meta level so that we can be better prepared the next time. But as being one that grew up during the plight of the Vietnam War, although I was very young, I keep being reminded that the ability to truly learn seems to be something that we're either not capable or we don't see the importance. That being said, let's take advantage of the opportunity to see whether, if we were to go back in a capsule and revisit some of those talks that took place over 50 years ago, to what degree we could actually use them as a jumping off point to better understand what is actually taking place today.
Well, when I got to Vietnam, I literally expected to be welcomed with open arms by the people of Vietnam. I had in my head the black and white newsreels I had seen on the Walter Cronkite 20th Century show of the American troops rolling through villages in France and being showered with wine and flowers and kisses. And as we were driving down, a guy from the battalion I was assigned to picked me up in a Jeep at Da Nang, and we had to drive the 20 miles to where my battalion was located, and I really was disappointed that there weren't people standing along the road waving to me and, you know, offering me flowers and things. I really expected to be greeted with open arms as a liberator, and it was as though I was invisible, as though I didn't exist. And that was a little perplexing. Moreover, they looked funny, and they acted funny. I mean, just riding along in this Jeep the first day I got there. They lived in little straw huts, and they had animals in their backyards, and they weren't like us. They smelled bad. The whole country smelled bad. You could smell it. It hurt the nose. And that was disturbing. And then I was there for on the third day I was there, this guy who had picked me up in the Jeep, a corporal who I was ultimately going to replace, he and I were in the battalion intelligence section. We were sent down to the tractor park, the amphibious tractor park, to meet a bunch of detainees. It was our responsibility to take care of prisoners, and detainees were a classification of civilians. They were not combatants. They could be detained for questioning, which is why they were called detainees. And Jimmy and I went down there to the track park, and two tractors came in. They had a whole bunch of Vietnamese up on top. High, flat-topped vehicles, about 8 or 9 feet tall. And as the tracks wheeled into the park, the Marines up on top immediately began hurling these people off. They were bound hand and foot so that they had no way of breaking their falls. And they were old men, women, children, no young men. And I couldn't believe these guys were treating these people this way. And I turned to Jimmy and I grabbed him by the arm and said, what are those guys doing? We're supposed to be helping these people. And Jimmy turned to me and he looked at my hands on his arm. I sort of took them off, and he said, "Earhart, you better keep your mouth shut until you know what's going on around here." And I think it was at that point that I realized things were not quite what I was expecting. It went downhill from there. And again, I can't even begin to explain in the space of time that you have all of the things that went into it, but I began to understand, it became obvious that the enemy was the very people in these villages around us, and we were in a very heavily populated area at that time. They were the enemy, or at least the enemy was out there somewhere, and we couldn't tell one from another. And day after day, our patrols went out, and we ran into snipers and mines, and snipers and mines, and snipers and mines. I saw 4 armed enemy soldiers the first 8 months I was in Vietnam. And yet our battalion during that same period of time sustained 75 mining and sniping incidents per month, over half of them resulting in casualties. This is for a unit of about 1,000 men. But there was no one to fight back at. And you begin to think, these people are the enemy. They're all the enemy. And then you go through villages and, you get sniped at, and so you call an airstrike in on the village and the whole village goes up. Or you go through a place and you search it and you burn houses and blow them up. The common perception, the notion I had when I was in high school was that the Viet Cong terrorized the Vietnamese population, forced them to fight against the Americans on pain of death. What I began to understand in Vietnam was that they didn't need to do things like that. All they had to do was let a Marine patrol go through a village, and whatever was left of that village they had all the recruits that they needed. I began to understand why the Vietnamese didn't greet me with open arms, why they in fact hated me. But of course that didn't change the fact that my friends were getting killed and injured every day, and the only place that you could focus your own anger and fear was on those civilians who were there. And so it was this self-perpetuating mechanism. The longer that we stayed in Vietnam, the more Viet Cong there were, because we created them, we produced them. None of that distilled itself into the clear kind of expression that I'm presenting now. What I began to understand within days, and which became patently clear within months, was that what was going on here was not what I had been told. What was going on here was nuts, and I wanted to get out. I knew if I were still alive on March the 5th, 1968, they'd stick me on an airplane in Da Nang. We used to call it the Freedom Bird. And I could fly away and forget the whole thing. Turned out not to be quite so easy to forget it, but that was the notion. And certainly for my last 8-9 months in Vietnam, I ceased to think. I quite literally ceased to think about why I was there or what I was doing. The sole purpose for my being in Vietnam at that point was to stay alive until I could get out. And the reason for that is that, the kinds of questions that began to present themselves were just, the questions themselves were ugly. And I didn't want to know the answers. It's like banging on a door. You knock on a door, and the door opens slightly, and behind that door it's dark, and there's loud noises coming, like there's wild animals in there or something. And you peer into the darkness and you can't see what's there, but you can hear all this ugly stuff. You want to step into that room? No way. You just sort of back out quietly, pull the door shut behind you, and walk away from it. And that's what was going on. The questions themselves were too ugly to even ask, let alone try to deal with the answers. Now, part of what was going on is that I could not have made sense of what I was seeing and doing in Vietnam because I did not have a full deck of cards. I needed to have an understanding of the political and historical realities that brought us to Vietnam before I could make sense of what I was seeing. I began to acquire the other cards in the deck during the 3 years or so after I got back from Vietnam. But while I was there, nothing made sense because I kept trying to, play this game with 27 cards instead of 52 cards, and it kept not coming out right. And I didn't know why. All I knew was that it was nuts. I mean, it became clear within 3 or 4 months that my reasons for being in Vietnam were not clear. I mean, this notion of defending the people against these invaders from North Vietnam, the people hated me. The Vietnamese people hated me. And it was that was perfectly clear. I mean, people didn't say good morning to you. People didn't, people hated me. I know that some other people's experience was different, but in my own experience, the Vietnamese people hated me, and I gave them every reason to hate me. I beat them. I sometimes killed them. I destroyed their houses. I destroyed their crops. I destroyed their fields. I destroyed their culture. Why in the hell should those people like me? And I could see that I was doing that. And I could see that nothing we were doing was having any impact on the war itself. The funny thing about Vietnam is that I was getting Time magazine every week. It came in the mail. I could read about my war even as I sat in the middle of it. And I would read about what Lyndon Johnson would say and what McNamara would say and what Rusk would say. And I could look around and see that, I don't know what war they're talking about, but that's not what's going on here. We actually had an incident happen where one of our line companies stumbled upon a fairly large cache of Viet Cong weapons and ammunition. And I read in the Stars and Stripes, the daily newspaper that we received, this little action actually made it into the papers, and we read that we had set the Viet Cong effort back by at least 4 months in our area. Within a week of that article appearing in the paper, within 10 days of the incident itself, the bridge 150 meters in front of our battalion compound was dropped by Viet Cong sappers. An Amtrak coming in from the Horseshoe area from one of the line companies hit a 50-pound box mine. Several men were killed, a bunch more were wounded. A patrol out at Phuoc Troc Bridge was ambushed. Several people were killed, several people were wounded. I mean, nobody told the Viet Cong that they'd been set back for 4 months. And yet this is what you're reading in the newspapers. This is what you're being told back in the United States. I could see that the war went on day after day after day, interminably, at the same pace, no matter what we did. I'm wasting your film. When I left Vietnam, I was in the midst of the battle for Hue City during Tet, 1968. This is February '68, and I'd been up in the city for 2.5, 3 weeks, and I knew that my day was coming, but I wasn't sure when. And at that point, we weren't thinking about things like that. And we were in the middle of a low-key firefight. We were exchanging fire with some guys across the street from us out along the eastern, the northeast section of Hue City. What was left of my unit, the scouts, about 6 of us. And a Jeep comes hauling up the street along the river and whips into this little compound where we were and says, "Earhart, your orders are in. Let's go." It was the lieutenant, my boss. And I stood, well, I didn't exactly stand up, but I immediately began to strip off my gear and distribute it to the other guys who were there and said, "So long, see you back in the world." Got on a Jeep. Last thing I saw of those guys, they were laying down covering fire for us. We burned our way back down the street. There was a chopper sitting on the LZ. I got on a bird. Was up 3,000 feet above Hue City 10 minutes after I knew I was on my way out. And went through some processing. They yanked me out early because one of my older brothers by this time had arrived in Vietnam, and they arranged for me to spend a couple of days with him. And I got back. I got back in early March. Came in at night. Went through more processing. A place called Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. And then I was free to go, and still had time in the Marines. I had a month's leave, basically, before I had to report to another duty station in North Carolina. And I got a taxi, and there I was, my first view of the United States, and I could hardly wait. And it was absolute impenetrable fog. We came across the Oakland Bay Bridge, couldn't see 10 feet, couldn't see anything. Got to the airport. There was part of what affected my coming back. I was happy to be alive. I was excited, but at the same time I was very ambivalent. I was afraid, partly because I had a girlfriend when I went over there, and in September, 8 months after I was there, I got a Dear John letter from her, and I kept hoping that I'd be able to fix this up once I got back. And I did not know what kind. And that woman, that girl, had become the focus of my life while I was in Vietnam. She had ceased to be a real person. She'd become this icon. And then, of course, she had sort of, said, "Take a hike." And but you can't just let go of a vision like that, of the thing that has kept you going. So I was scared about all of that. I didn't know what I was going to find when I finally got back to the East Coast.
Now, I know that some of you will think that this is not the time to think such thoughts. Some of you will say that some sort of bias is being displayed. And I guess if we are talking about a bias, the bias would be pro-human. Pro-human, that's right. Could we imagine a conversation that could take place today, probably couldn't be released under the current circumstances, but could we imagine that we would have a similar discussion from a Russian soldier who did not ask for the war, was given propaganda not too dissimilar to this gentleman, that we would be talking about the same war, might be called something different, that we would be talking about the Great Patriotic War. And they would be told that people would be waiting on the streets to celebrate their arrival. Can we imagine that? Could we imagine that conversation coming from that same individual who would go into detail to talk about the atrocities that took place in Bucha or Mariupol, or the list is very long. And that conversation would include the realization that the message they had received up till that point in time was wrong. It was wrong. That they were not liberators. They were indeed duped. And just like the gentleman that we just heard from, there would be one thought in their minds, only one thought. And that would be, how in the hell do they get out of this mess? Could we imagine that conversation taking place? Can we? As I mentioned, I was very much part of that generation, and I remember when the doubts within the populace started to become more prominent, and without really understanding what all of this was about, and already being thrown into the conditioning that is tied to this concept of dualism, that it's either right or it's wrong. I remember in Los Angeles calling the talk-in radio to ask a question to the presenter, whether he was for or against the Vietnam War. I had no idea what I was asking. Certainly could not understand the nuances the intentions, the power, the duplicity. And this was really when the pushback was starting to take place. And so this presenter came back and said, no, he's not in favor of the Vietnam War. And I said, thank you very much. And that was the extent of the conversation. But we continued getting optimistic reports coming from the Pentagon, especially from General Westmoreland. And they continued, although the pressure was already mounting, questioning what is the objective, not too dissimilar to what Erhard was talking about. What was the objective? What were we trying to accomplish? What are our critical success factors? Nobody knew. And this continued on to 1968. I'd like to play another piece from A Soldier's Recollection from that war that actually has more parallels than I realized when I started this project.
We set up a perimeter, and I was point. I led my battalion in. We went in, and we set this huge perimeter up. And I was set up behind, in front of like a pagoda-type statue area, and we dug in fighting holes. And we started to take incoming rounds from the NVA, and they were testing our lines. And so we called in gunship support from the 1st Air Cav. So 1st Air Cav said, smoke your lines. And what you do is usually throw a smoke grenade out there, and they can see where the perimeter is at. And what happened was, instead of them attacking the NVA, they attacked us, the 1st Air Cav. They came in with Cobra gunships, and we were in a firefight, and then I looked up, and I seen these puffs of smoke. And you could actually see the rockets take off, and I said, that can't be coming at me. And I just turned to get my right leg out of my fighting hole. And when I turned, the rocket actually glanced off my left hip. And they fired 3 rockets at me. And all of a sudden, there was these massive explosions around me. And I just went down. And I put myself, I was smoking and, a little bit on fire and stuff like that. And I tried to put myself out and try to get oriented to what was going on. So I was pissed off, so I went to grab my rifle, because now I'm mad at the gunship and I want to fire at the helicopter, and my rifle's bent like a horseshoe. And I was a big Sylvan collector. I had all of these Sylvan that I was bringing back from my kid brother. And when that rocket hit me, it decimated all my, my Sylvan. So I guess that helped me in a great way, because it took the focus off me concentrating on how bad a shape I was. So I looked down on my leg, and my leg was bent like an L. It was just hanging by a small piece of meat. And I took my leg and I straightened my leg out, and I tried to take my shoelace off and try to, to tie my leg back on, which was not going to happen. And then all of a sudden I started yelling, medevac, medevac, and people started to come up to me, and they put mesh wire on me and tried to hold my leg in position and stuff like that. And so they were trying to get me out. Now we're in this massive firefight with an NVA division. All these helicopters are shot down, so regimental commanders calling in for medevacs, and none of the helicopters will come in. They said, we're not coming in. So the regimental commander said, if you don't come in, we'll shoot you down. So, an old Marine 34, which they used in Korea, I guess he had a tremendous amount of heart. He came in, and they threw me on the chopper, and I remember I was in Da Nang, and I woke up for a short period of time, and I looked down there, and there was a guy taking a pair of scissors, and he just snipped the remaining piece of flesh out of my leg, and my leg went one way and I went the other way, and then I was in the hospital system from that point on after I was hit.
We hit a sniper that killed the guy that was only 3 feet away from me. And the guy had just gotten a Dear John letter that day, and I knew that he wasn't going to make it. You know, just his attitude in going out was very, very negative, and you can't be like that. You've got to think of, I'm going to make it through the day. You know, I'm going home. I want to make it.
May 5th, 1970, the 101st Airborne invaded Cambodia out of our fire base, or our home field. A few days later, when I had 4 days left of my tour of duty, North Vietnamese sent troops across the border, captured a artillery base from the ARVN soldiers, turning cannons on our fire base. Once they came over, heard the first one come over, I said to my company commander, "That sounds like artillery." He said, "You watching too many John Wayne movies." When that round hit, it picked up a 5-ton truck and threw it about 30 feet in the air in flames. We had nowhere to hide. We had nothing that would stop a 155 howitzer round. So for that 5-10 minutes that we were shelled, it was pretty scary.
We had been searching an area that was known to have Viet Cong and hidden tunnels. And we had 2 dog teams. And we were working side by side about maybe 50, 75 yards or feet away from each other. And we were leading patrol. And the other dog team picked up an alert. And as the dog picked up an alert, a Viet Cong jumped up and started running across a field. And his shotgun bodyguard took out the Viet Cong. And out of nowhere, on my right flank, a woman jumped out of a bunker, and she started running towards us. And she had quite a big knife in her hand, and she's just yelling and screaming. Stormy moved out in front of me and hit her, and I shot her, and I just hit her in the arm. I mean, we had 45s. We were really never trained at marksmanship with a 45, so I hit her in the arm. And she just, her momentum, she just kept coming. And then my shotgun came around and hit her with the rifle and knocked her out. That was probably my scariest moment, because it was so close and it was unexpected. And I just remember, you know, I thanked Stormy, but I was like totally shaken. I had to actually sit down after it happened. That was probably my really scariest moment.
Amid some considerable heckling, I did it every day. I was to get on my knees in the jungle and say a prayer to St. Joseph that my mother gave me before I left. And my recon sergeant professed to be an atheist. And so he was a tough guy. I think he had been on his 3rd tour at that point. So there was no end to the barbs that would come my way from Sergeant Turner, who was a good man. And after that, we were on an operation. There had been a situation where they thought there were sightings of American POWs. So I got my recon sergeant and my RTO, and I said, when the rest of these guys start crawling back out of here, you go with them, and I'm going to stay. And my recon sergeant said, LT, we're going to stay right here and die with you. And I was pretty convinced this was going to be it. And I looked at the date on my watch was November the 17th of 71. And I realized it was my mother's birthday. And I said, I can't believe I'm going to buy the farm on my mother's birthday. And with that, Sergeant Turner, the atheist, crawled over to me and he said, "Hey, LT, do you have that prayer?"
Villogis Shtetl, Radio Tipping Point. And yes, we have a clear parallel. Mentioned earlier, 1967. It's where the The heat was being turned up within the U.S. populace. And why 67? Why did it happen in 1967? So did the war start in 67? No. The war had actually been a continuation of the French Indochina War that came to a so-called peace settlement where they took the Korean model and slapped it onto Vietnam. And so the hostilities continued. But they weren't making any progress. And then there was the so-called Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, where basically Lyndon Johnson had decided that this was going to be his moment, not too dissimilar to W in Iraq or in Afghanistan. But there was one difference. There was one difference up till that point in time. There was conscription in the United States. But if you were white and had some money, then there was ways to avoid military service. And we have plenty of examples of those that went that route, one being Bill Clinton, the other one being Donald Trump. But it was only when the U.S. government realized that they could not rely upon the minorities that had been fighting the war up to that point in time. They could not rely solely on the minorities, so they had to tap in to the rest of the male populace. And that meant that a university deferral became more difficult, although certainly possible. But it was only at that time, when whites started to die in Vietnam, did the heat really go up. And yes, that was around 1967. Around 1967. And so we see the parallels within Russia, where up to that point in time, the privileged ones of St. Petersburg and Moscow were more or less spared. But Putin came to the realization that was not enough. That was not enough. And it's just a matter of time before we start getting these stories, not too dissimilar to Erhard, the first story that we had in this program today. And let's continue with one last round. And as mentioned in the beginning of the show, I focus primarily on stories from soldiers to allow for us to reflect on that human condition. And then we will continue next week looking at some of the political and sociological movements that were taking place, and we'll continue with that search for parallels.
I volunteered. I thought I joined because I thought it was my duty to do so. I also thought that I was going to go one way or another, so I might as well go on my terms. So I stayed in ROTC, took the flight program, got my pilot's license, and everybody I knew, most everybody I knew, eventually went.
I was working at the time as a dishwasher in the hospital, and I said, this is not a future for me. I just had to do something else. And I knew I wanted to go in the Air Force anyway, just a matter of time. So when I graduated in June, I was gone in August.
I was a student at Ohio Wesleyan College in 1966, and I was in my sophomore year, and I was really struggling with trying to, really pursue the right kind of activities in college. I was becoming a very proficient bridge player and was discovering a social life that I never discovered while I was in high school. At the end of my first semester of my sophomore year, I got a letter from Ohio Wesleyan asking me to sit out for a semester and reflect on, the academic performance that I was achieving. And, of course, in 1966, that was, military suicide. That was like within 2 weeks, I got my notice for a draft physical.
I enlisted on my 17th birthday. It had nothing to do with the Vietnam War, which I knew very little about. I was going into the Navy anyway because my father was in the Navy. And my personal heroes were first my father and then President Kennedy.
Once I got drafted, the decision was made for me. The government made it. I didn't have to make it. They made it. They got me, and that was it.
I was approximately 21 years old, and myself and two of my best buddies from high school decided that we were going to go into the Army to take advantage of their electronic education programs, and we had hoped to go to Germany to drink beer and meet German women. I completed a year of cryptography repair, studying at Fort Monmouth, and then when it was time to be reassigned from Monmouth, our group, my class, was told we were going to Vietnam, and I could still vividly remember standing in front of the table saying, "It's got to be a mistake. Please check your records." They said, "Nope, go get your weapon and you're on your way to Vietnam."
Well, I come from a long line of Marines. I'm a third-generation combat Marine. My father served at Iwo Jima. My uncle's at Guadalcanal, and my other uncle's at the Cho Sen Reservoir, and I served in Vietnam. So it was just a continuation of a family heritage that continued in the Marine Corps.
When I was graduating high school, I knew I didn't have money for college. Thought that the military could provide that after I got out, and wanted to do something. Vietnam was really, at the height in 1967, and I thought I could make a difference and do something important.
I was always, as a young boy, I would watch Victory at Sea on television. I had read a lot of the books about World War II Navy activities. I don't know. All other kids were reading other books. That's what I was reading. So I just had this thing that said I want to go in the Navy, and that was it.
This draft was over your head. It was like a sledgehammer, and you knew you were going to get either drafted or you were going to get out of it one way or the other. And it kind of ruined your whole life. Really, it directed you which way you were going to go, and you couldn't get a decent job because everybody knew you were going to be drafted. It was just a matter of time before they would find you.
My mother said there was something there from the U.S. government. Opened it up and it says, report for induction. What's this? And Vietnam was really nothing then.
And I chose the Marine Corps. Why? I guess I thought that they were the best to learn how to fight with. And I was sort of like a street guy in a way, one of the real ruffian type guys. Not that I was a big fighter, but this is the impression I was and what I wanted to be. So I said, we'll go into the Marine Corps.
I graduated high school in 1965, and I graduated from a prep school in Newark. 95% of the class went on to college, but my father was ill, so I had to go to work. Probably wasn't the best time for that to happen, but in and about a year later, 1966, September, I got drafted.
How about that? You cannot get a job because everybody knew that you were going to be drafted. Lodges, Shtetl, Radio Tipping Point. Rumsfeld was making this point this morning. To the ordinary guy, all this is a bunch of gobbledygook. But out of the gobbledygook comes a very clear thing. You can't trust the government. You can't believe what they say. And you can't rely on their judgment and the implicit infallibility of presidents, which has been an accepted thing in America, is badly hurt by this because it shows that people do things the president wants to do even though it's wrong. And the president can be wrong. Richard Nixon, 14th of June, 1971. So they knew it was wrong, but it was the sunk cost fallacy all over again. We've spent so much time. We've spent so much time that we can't stop now. We have no brakes, so we cannot stop. We have no brakes, so we cannot stop. We have no brakes, so we cannot stop. 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 Cannot stop.
Usually if we were out on an operation about 7 days, something like that, they would try to get a hot meal out there. And the military had they had these standard cases, which I guess a lot of the coolers today are copied from. But they send the hot cases out or the cold cases out aboard helicopters, and everybody come by, get a steak and something like that there. I mean, that was kind of popular. It was easy to do. And give mail call, a little hot food, ready to go for another 3-4 days.
I can remember our base camp. We had a mama-san, it was an elderly lady that would, you could give her your clothes and she would wash them for her. And, some of the guys became friendly. Well, she invited a whole bunch of us over to her house. And she cooked dinner for us. I mean, it was amazing, Had no clue I saw a lot of claws and feet in the pot. I had no
Being in the field, there are no bathrooms in the field. There's no showers. There's no nothing. If it rained, you stood in the rain. If you saw a river, you jumped in the river. And you couldn't use soap, which seems odd, but if you use soap, they can actually smell the aroma from the soap. So we couldn't even do that.
If you take a 55-gallon drum, fill it about a third of the way with diesel fuel, find a piece of plywood and cut a hole in it and place that piece of plywood on top of the 55-gallon drum, you now have a toilet. It doesn't flush very well at all, but what you then do each morning, somebody gets the detail of carrying this drum to the end of the compound and taking out their Zippo and lighting up that diesel fuel.
I'd die for Spam over that fire and a hot chocolate. And to read, for probably the 50th time, a letter from home.
A new cook came on board to take over responsibility, and he looked at me and asked me if I wanted to learn how to bake. And I thought, let's see, learning how to bake or going back and cleaning toilets. I think I'll opt for the baking. To feed a crew dessert for the next day, I would have to make 17 pies. And I can remember, and of course, pies were one of probably the most favorite thing for those guys to eat. And so I probably made pies at least 2 or 3 times a week.
The living conditions in Vietnam were interesting. Actually, I was very lucky. This base camp had already been built. The latrines or outhouses had already been built. Showers are already built, so I didn't have to, I was like moving in. We had a cot, a canvas cot, which was no big deal. I had done that in Boy Scouts. I'd slept on a cot, so it didn't really bother me. But a lot of people who had never been in, camping or out in the woods had a tough time, especially the, people who came from the cities. It was a totally different ball of wax, if you will.
All right, we were based next to an artillery company, so we had a regular mess hall. And everybody likes to complain. It's just Army chow. It's usual fare, and food cooked for 250, 300 people has a different taste from what Mom was cooking at home. And then if we were out on convoys, we had C rations that we could stop the convoy and we could eat those. Punch a little hole in it, wire it to the exhaust manifold of the truck if you wanted to heat it, and by the time we got to go where we were going, you had a little hot meal. But C rations weren't that good. A lot of them were packed during the Korean War.
I became a connoisseur of C rations. I actually gained weight in Vietnam. My mother would send me over stuff, and we would get Spam, and I would dock up all of these C rats, and it became quite enjoyable. And everybody used to come around me to see what I was actually putting together and stuff like that.
We were very blessed to be part of an Air Force facility. The officers had a club, which we were not allowed to go in, but we had a very good NCO club where we can go to buy drinks and get food. Our food was absolutely phenomenal once you became used to having rice and iced tea frequently, but the food was just well prepared by people that waited on you with a smile.
Food was 24/7, which was, everybody had the different days. I mean, there were days where the guy who slept next to you didn't see him for months. He was on a different shift than you were.